I'm John Crow with USDN. Pleased to welcome you back to what is the third and final installation in this three-part series on broadly beneficial clean energy planning. I'm really excited to be kicking things off today and looking forward to some great conversation and discussion. As a reminder, this training is specifically focused on using quantitative tools and specifically scenario planning in equity-centered clean energy planning processes. And needless to say, the landscape of the national conversation and attention has shifted significantly since we started this training series in April. My hope is that many of you are seeing in the communities you work in and in the institutions you work in a greater openness and opportunity to advance equitable engagement and community leadership, and to do so in areas related to clean energy. We're really hoping this training is already providing you with some of the tools and specific ways to help use government's technical capacity to support community leadership in the areas of local government that you work in. And this theme of privilege capacity and supporting frontline leadership with privilege capacity is a theme that Ted and Lacey are going to be leading a conversation around shortly. So on that note, let me take a minute to introduce our speakers. Ted or Eric, if you'd advance it. So today, welcoming back Eric Macris and Ted Wong and Lacey Shaver from the World Resources Institute, as well as Yo-Rong Ji and Matt Cox from GreenLink Analytics. And we'll also be hearing from Brittany Sellers from the City of Orlando, talking about the city's experience assessing, selecting, and designing energy policies and programs. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Eric, who's going to give us some more detail on today's session, recap some of the previous trainings, and take us forward into the content. Eric.
Perfect. Thanks so much, John. And hi, everybody. Glad you're here again. And thanks for being with us on this journey. We've already been through 2 sessions focusing on stage setting and baseline data, defining and modeling scenarios. And today we're focused on turning scenarios into policies. And as we all know, throughout we've been doing this scenario planning test exercise. And today we're going to be focused primarily on reviewing some of the scenario outcomes that have resulted from the scenario inputs that you selected between the last session and today. So a reminder of our core theory of change of what we're aiming to convey in these trainings is understanding how these tools can work together, how scenario planning can provide information as a huge and big contribution to power and how we design better interventions on clean energy. But power doesn't get us anywhere if we don't know where we're going, driven by values and the voice of those that we want to serve. So that's where the equity focus comes in, and the elements to make sure that we're able to include equity to be the driver of our direction on this work. So session 1, as I noted, we've looked at already principles of equity and inclusive stakeholder engagement, principles of scenario planning, and then selecting indicators and baseline data. In session 2, we looked at the equity indicator baselines that we developed with input around which indicators are most important to you. We looked at scenario development, how to think about the options available, and then thinking about the strengths and weaknesses and considerations to be taken into account as you're doing scenario modeling. And we've also made this journey through the different components of equitable clean energy scenario planning. And today we're focused on these elements at the end here, focused on impacts, policies, and programs, and again, emphasizing the importance of distributional design. By the end of the day today, you should have some improved ability to identify practices to use your privilege capacity as planners and government officials to support frontline leadership, feel comfortable interpreting the model scenario outcomes that we're going to be discussing, being familiar with the methods for identifying and prioritizing policies, and also helping to facilitate a stakeholder-driven process for designing and implementing policies and programs. So here's the agenda. The next hour and a half is the core session. We're going to be walking through these different topics that I already essentially just mentioned, as well as hearing a case study from Brittany Sellers in the City of Orlando and their work on policy and program assessment, selection and design. And we also have time at the end for an optional question and answers discussion session. We want to make sure we have time to talk with you about what are some of the next steps critically after the end of this training. How do you want to take this into your work and continue the learnings from here? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted.
Okay, thanks. So, as John said, in the months since our last webinar, the national conversation has shifted quite a bit, and it's now focused on police brutalization of Black communities and more generally on discriminatory and oppressive practices and structures in government and in broader society. And so in the spirit of honest reflection and commitment to change, we wanted to start this webinar by acknowledging that well-intentioned, data-driven government actions can often perpetuate and exacerbate fundamental injustices in the community. So here on this slide, I just put a couple of relevant examples of a typical technocratic approach to big societal problems. So here it's the COVID pandemic and climate change. And in this technocratic approach, we start by isolating the drivers of the problem. And we apply data, modeling, policy analysis, basically all of our expertise to analyzing those drivers. And we craft a solution. And what happens? Often the burdens and the benefits of the actions are distributed unfairly, worsening existing inequities. So as an example, there's a paper out last year, slide, looking at green development in Boston. And it's short, I recommend it. Dozens of projects to build green infrastructure, develop open space, reduce flooding risk along 47 miles of Boston's shorelines. By the way, it's in PNAS, the references at the bottom. So green land development. And while there were efforts made to, for example, preserve affordable housing, for the most part, there were problems at every phase of these projects, including planning, modeling, financing, and rollout. And so I just list some of the specifics that the authors highlighted, problems with planning and exclusion of frontline communities, problems with modeling, and well, so I'm going to get to that. So slide. So I wanted to focus on two aspects of the kind of problem solving that we as experts tend to gravitate to. First is the isolation of problem drivers. Really, I'm talking about the definition of what's part of the problem and what's extraneous to the problem. So, back in that Boston example, flooding risk in neighborhoods adjacent to the new developments were often not included in the modeling. And in those adjacent neighborhoods, the flood risk increased after the development projects were completed, as an example. Second, I want to highlight the tendency of solutions to be all about engaging the holders of power. So the example from Boston, most of the financing came from private investors. And as a result, most of the green development was sort of luxury, high-end development targeted at a particular population in Boston. Now, we're all used to working with, wooing, and partnering with power holders. But, I just want to acknowledge that solving problems by engaging power holders can lead to unfair distributions of benefits. So what do? Well, we, of course, don't have all the answers, but the big answer that we're pushing in this training series is to let affected communities steer the bike, leave problem definition to frontline communities, draw perspectives and priorities from frontline communities, and generally cede real power to frontline communities. So slide. So what we're proposing is that as government officials and supporting research institutions, we take as our role using our privileged capacity to empower frontline leadership. So in this idea, power comes from our access to data, technical expertise, legal authorities, but power is not necessarily, it doesn't have to be the same thing as leadership, and we can make a deliberate, intentional choice to allow frontline communities to lead and to support that leadership. So we have a lot of capacity, And it's our job to figure out how to make that capacity available to the community leaders in forms that are usable by them. Okay, so this is sort of an overall theme of our training, and you know, I just want to put it in these terms. So slide. Now, we'll still be facilitating meetings here and there, and when we do that, we do find ourselves standing at the front of the room. We can, and I'll just highlight a few of these suggestions. Deliberately listen, build common languages, make space for authentic sharing, and generally maintain the clear distinction between our own goals and the goals of the community, recognizing that they might be different and that the community goals are what have primacy.
Thank you, Lacey. So this is just a quick reminder of what we've sent around to the dozen or so cities that we've developed a scenario calculator tool for. Just a refresher, what the tool does is that it takes a look at the 2020 kind of baseline conditions and then makes a series of projections out through 2030, focusing on energy consumption within each city, estimates what the total cost-effective energy efficiency and rooftop solar potentials are for each and how those could be developed over the next decade, and then produces a series of outputs. So we have user inputs coming from each of the city around what % of that total potential they'd like to pursue, how they would like to direct their energy efficiency investments, so what kind of an emphasis they want to place on putting an emphasis on low-income investments, and then seeing what the outputs are. And so you'll get the results show the total investments, the net benefits. When you see the overall dashboard, we added another one to show the total benefits so that there'd be a little less confusion looking at those. Your benefit cost ratio, some economic development impacts around job creation, a little bit of information around how much solar and energy efficiency was achieved and how many tons of CO2 we'd expect to be avoided by the particular scenario that's been characterized by the user. So we're hoping that this gives each city a bit of a ballpark estimate for what they might expect to see if they pursued those strategies. These are some of the results that we saw from what the 12 level 1 cities submitted back to us. And so you can see that we had kind of a confluence there at about a 50% effort being pursued, at least as what was provided as inputs here for the calculators. A little bit more aggressive on residential efficiency, but not tremendously different really across all of them. And then the other distinction that we have here is how much of the energy efficiency investments were going to head towards the low-income communities. The reminder here is if you set low, that was leaving it essentially as it is today. That was a business as usual characterization. So interesting that nobody wanted to do that. But some distinguishing features here between the group on the amount of folks that wanted to do kind of getting halfway, 25% of the portfolio spend going towards the low-income community, and then another chunk that wants to put half of those efficiency dollars towards those low-income programs.
Yeah, we've invited Eric from Colombia to give a few comments on why he made the selections he did, which we're now showing in the yellow dots, how Colombia, what numbers we assessed for Colombia. Eric, do you want to share your thinking?
Yeah, sure. It's really fairly straightforward, or at least it started off that way. We just completed our climate action adaptation plan. And so I initially tried to align the outputs of the calculator with the assumptions that we made in our wedge analysis. And with the intent to try to test how well our centering intention of starting our analysis of those climate action plan actions, of centering those, that analysis with equity. Tried to tune the calculator that way. And as far as the efficiency programs, residential and commercial efficiency numbers, when it became pretty clear after I talked with the efficiency program implementers that action levels there should be fairly attainable, which is good. They're below the group's average there, I see now. And then, you know, for the solar energies, a little bit of a different outcome. The wedge assumptions that we used when we're developing our CAP proved to go beyond the calculator's maximum action levels. So those might end up being a little too optimistic or ambitious. So then we also, during this whole process, and one of the reasons why I think, and I hope that we'll be able to use this, this tool in the future some more, is we're also, our municipal utility is undergoing a refresh of the integrated resource plan. And I just got the distributed solar projections for that modeling process. And they are quite a bit lower, about 85% lower than our wedge assumptions. So all that kind of rolled together and ended up putting us at about that 50% of residential and commercial solar potential. So overall, just trying to line up our assumptions with the wedge analysis and the outputs of the calculator.
Perfect. Thanks, Eric. Patricia, we'd also asked if you wanted to share anything. I don't know if you had any comments you wanted to make about Miami-Dade in your thinking.
Yeah, so similarly what Eric was saying, in Miami-Dade County, we are doing our greenhouse gas emissions inventory and forecasting exercise. We are tying that exercise to our sustainability plan. We are having a sustainability plan version 2.0. And so what we are trying to do is align these calculators to some of the evaluations that we see for the forecasting. One of our goals is really to implement and increase the energy efficiency and renewable energy here in my county, not only for county parks, but for the community. So wanted to make that we could align this effort with that how we can better find synergy in between the two we want to. So we think that we are, unfortunately, we are the sunshine state, but with very little renewable energy side in place here. And so we want to push that and push the envelope, and that's why we select like a halfway scenario, a little bit more with the commercial, because with existing buildings, the large existing, so they have renewable energy and well as energy efficiency. And we wanted to tie both energy efficiency and to healthy people, and really emphasize that now that we are all working from home and sheltering from home, that
Did we lose her?
Lost Patricia.
Yeah. Thanks, Patricia. We'll have a chance to come back to you again in just a moment.
I'm not sure that I was kicked out for a while. I don't know if you guys were able to hear everything or not. Apologize.
That's fine. Thank you for sharing, and we're going to ask you to reflect again in a minute. So stay with us, and hopefully your connection will stay strong. Matt, back to you.
Yeah. So this is what we're producing now for this session, and the level 1 city should have received this earlier this week. So this is a snapshot of the dashboard that takes a look at what the spread of energy burden is within each of the cities, and then takes a look at what the impact of the choices made in the scenario calculator would be, and how those would impact energy burden across the communities. So in this particular case, you're taking a look at Asheville here, and with this level of effort, there's a pretty significant improvement that you can visibly see between the two maps, between where we are, where we're looking that we would have been in 2030 without taking any action, which is that map on the left, and where you'd end up if these energy efficiency and solar investments were made. And the differences are placed in these little report cards down here underneath. So each of them are going to show a whole series of zeros for the business as usual side because we're not changing anything. So the values are going to be, the differences are all going to come out to be nothing. But when we're taking a look at the report card on the right, that's where you're going to see a number of those differences come forward. And you can see in that particular case, there's quite a good number of benefits that look like you might expect to see happen should this pathway be chosen, should these clean energy investments go forward.
And with that, maybe back to you, Eric, if you want to comment at all, particularly on these scenario output maps for Columbia.
Yeah, well, they look remarkably similar, I guess, and there's virtually no change. I think what a 0.1% improvement in the median energy burden, and no real difference in across any specific tract. So really, I think more of the insight that I found was in using the data kind of behind these maps, which was very helpful. And I think really lends more credence to the idea that we should push for higher energy efficiency action levels, and that more than likely those cap actions don't go far enough. While they might meet certain greenhouse gas reduction goals, they don't seem to be really getting at the issue of reducing energy burden. So I found that to be a helpful insight in kind of the no change result. Also, as I looked further into the data behind more of our indicators, the indicators we chose were race and housing cost. And it really seems to challenge at least some of the assumptions that we've made on the data level of the census tracts. The assumptions that there's a high correlation between race and energy burden. I mean, certainly there's a very strong correlation between median income and energy burden. But the data behind doesn't necessarily seem to support that energy burden being consistent across the different racial makeups of our census tracts. So that's just a more interesting question. I think finally that red, if we scroll down to the bottom maps again, that little red kernel in the middle, that's the highest energy burden. It seems, and take a little bit more digging and drilling into the data, it seems to be at least somewhat influenced by the student population in that area. That's where a lot of the student housing and new student complexes are. There's also some older housing that's not necessarily dominated by student tenants, but a lot of times, at least in, in less data-driven approaches, the student population is not necessarily considered as much in the energy burden, with assumptions being that their parents might be paying for more of it. But I think that it really helped us it holds those tracks up as needing more, I think, fuller investigation. So those are just some of the insights we've been able to get so far.
Wonderful. Thanks, Eric. Patricia, do you want to say a few words about the Miami-Dade results?
Sure. So I guess if you start in the middle, I guess, so we give the story a little bit. The two indicators that we selected was asthma rates and eviction rates. And you can see that for that, I know the blue maps are not on a scale, but you see the same little census tract towards the south. That is the darkest, and it's both for that one, correct? It's has a very high energy burden, has a high eviction rate, and has a high asthma rate. So we can see how the things correlate very well, and how we can have our assumption that the things go hand in hand could be supported, and we have another way of justifying more attention to it. If you go down to the last two maps, when we add the energy efficiency and the renewable energy, we can see that by going the next maps, those ones, correct, the bottom ones, you can see how the map start turning green, definitely paying off energy efficiency and the renewable energy. We have been very, our scenario was very aggressive. And I think one of the points we want to make is either turn green or turn blue, because the sea level rise and the flooding happening. So we have not much option to be very aggressive if we want to conserve our map green, as is stated. So it's really enlightening to see how the changes you can make really help with the different problems, and it creates your justification of supports your justification in a more direct and data-driven way that hopefully can change the mind of the decision makers. So we even see that little cluster that we were seeing in the other maps, that it was a dark pink or dark or almost red. It lowers as well, and the surroundings turn green. So I think that we knew that this is the way we wanted to go, but now we have the data to make a more robust case.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric and Patricia, for sharing those insights. Data and maps can be so enlightening, and it's great when things correlate and they can really justify the investments you want to make. It's also interesting when you get some of the results you didn't expect, like when Eric said, well, we were getting the GHG emissions results that we wanted, but if we were actually trying to solve for energy burden too, we might need to really think about those actions. And I think that's a tension we see a lot, is that sometimes the things with the biggest GHG reductions are often those that, they might not correlate to community kind of priorities. So something to always keep in the back of your minds. For our next section about how we actually use these scenarios to identify policies and programs.
Okay, thanks. All right, so the idea is you have several scenario outputs, and you need to know which one describes the future that your community wants. And it's not necessarily an obvious question, because remember that these scenarios can include several variables and include trade-offs. And so it's useful to come up with ways of organizing our thinking about these things. So there are three broad categories of things that we suggest you consider. The core goals that you and your stakeholders set for your planning process at the beginning. the overall vision that the community has for its future. And there are probably going to be additional benefits that didn't necessarily come up early in the process, but that will come out in the modeling and in, in discussion. Now, as usual, there are lots of ways of structuring this question of which scenario is best. And we're not going to, that is lots of different methods and sort of devices. We're not going to go into them in detail, but I'll just say that you should use many. You should use many methods. Sometimes there's a tendency to dump this question, or questions in general, to dump the question to an evaluation matrix or a survey. But any single method is going to be biased in terms of whose perspectives it reflects. And the fullest, richest answers will come from actual conversations and from multi-format engagements with the communities. So I'm going to hand off to Matt to talk about how GreenLink dealt with scenario evaluation in Atlanta. And Matt, you're going to turn it back to me when you're done.
Yeah, great. So yeah, we actually used all of the options that Ted showed on the prior slide in working with Atlanta on their 100% clean energy plan. But this was a slide that got a lot of use in town hall conversations that we had and meetings with city council members. And so I'll just briefly describe what these are. We had produced an interactive model that would allow city staff as well as community members to create their own scenarios, kind of similar to what you guys have been doing, a beefed up version of the scenario calculator that we've been playing with here. And we created these 3 scenarios as just kind of benchmarks for people to compare against. And so the first one, scenario number 1 that you can see here, we called the I bumped my head, I woke up and it was 2035 scenario. That was where you were going to hit 100% in 2035, but you had taken no actions between today and that end date. But you still had a mandate that you had to comply with as the city. So how did you do it? And the way that it's done in that case, it's accomplished through the purchase of renewable energy credits. And you just buy a ton of renewable energy credits and you get it that way. So from that, it's the cheapest pathway that was available, but it also shows no benefits to the community. You're mostly spending money on Oklahoma and Texas wind farms at that point. Then we had the 50% scenario, which was popular because it was one of the most cost effective in terms of a benefit cost ratio, and the 100% scenario. So the 50% one is scenario number 2 here. And you can see the total investment that's required for that. Coming up on $400 million, it's not nothing as far as money goes. But you're also looking at a return of over $15 billion for that investment. And so that's a mix of public health benefits as well as direct energy savings that you would expect to come to the community. And we broke that out into a series of equivalencies to try to help people relate to it. So since this was Atlanta, we used Coca-Cola headquarters as a point of comparison for the employment metrics. We used Delta Airlines as a point of comparison for the revenue implications. And then traffic is bad in Atlanta like it is in many cities. So we tried to put the CO2 reductions in terms of months without cars on the road, because people get very excited when you tell them that there's no cars, you're not stuck in traffic for an hour and a half trying to get home. So 7 months without cars for scenario 2 there. And then scenario 3 is kind of, we're going after everything. So you get towards some pretty expensive investments in that one that are still being pursued, but you can see the benefit cost ratio, it's still very positive for what you expect to see come back to the city. It's about a 20-to-1 return there. And then the other thing that we focused on that we found really interesting in that scenario was the benefits to everyone that was connected to the power system that Atlanta is situated within. So the savings driven forward by the clean energy deployments in Atlanta were going to reduce the cost of operating the utility and should translate then into lower rates for most of the rest of the state of Georgia. And so there's a financial benefit that goes far beyond city limits in that particular case. So the the main things that we got back out of the town halls and also from our surveys were also these value statements from the citizenry. So we had about 4,000 citizens participate in developing these 3 statements. But we pulled from that. Energy equity was the very first thing they wanted to focus on. And so this was late 2017. I think that would just be put in bold and italics with stars on the side of it right now, if we were to put that out again. We wanted the city wanted to see investments in energy efficiency increased, in part due to the job multiplier effects and keeping the dollars local, sides that could come from that. And then lastly, local investments in renewable energy needed to be prioritized over investments outside of the Atlanta area. People really didn't like the idea of buying the renewable energy credits as a way to make it over the finish line. Although, as you can see, if you look at those scenarios, renewable energy credits play a role in all 3. So there was not a case that we ran where Atlanta was able to get there entirely by actions within their own footprint.
All right, thanks. So now your community has identified the scenario that seems best. So the next big task is to identify specific policies and programs that get you from the present to that future. Yeah, those like the I am a bill guy, those things are the policies and programs. Anyway, and in general, you'll face a lot of options. This is a list, it's overwhelming. And so what we're going to talk about is ways to organize how to think about the big messy universe of policies and programs that are out there. So slide there. And so what we're going to point you to is toolkits. So here are some prominent policy toolkits. They're included in the list of supplemental resources that we're sending you. And we're not going to dive into these in detail, but slide. It can be useful to organize this universe of actions by either energy subsector or influence mechanisms. So depending on your city's situation, you might be constrained by political or economic considerations in which sectors you have freedom or leverage in, or your powers might be constrained. So before diving into these toolkits, many of which are organized by these schemes, it makes sense to clarify what sectors and influence channels are open to you. And then policy identification becomes partly an exercise in narrowing down. You start with a sector, which is really just in these toolkits, it's a broad category that includes several types of actions. And each action type, like in this case, incentives as an action type, each of these actions types has more specific types of program associated with it. And each program type will take you to specific programs. And each of these policy toolkits will give you concrete real world examples, case studies, sometimes like example code language, real world examples from cities that have implemented those programs. But you probably won't be able to filter and narrow your way down to your ideal set of policies and programs. So there's still work for your community stakeholders to do. There's still a need for their priorities and values to enter into things. So I'm going to hand off to Eric to talk a bit about choosing among different policies.
Going through the process that Ted described, it can be really helpful in at least narrowing down the list of options that are appropriate to your goals and your strategy. And that, from your scenario. The next level is really around, doing kind of a deeper filtering or assessment of the dimensions of the policies that make sense to you. So generally, we're suggesting that you think of at least 3 dimensions of policy desirability, feasibility, desirability, and impact being those 3 dimensions. And each of those can be very big concepts. And so there are, and in addition to several of the more traditional indicators you may be considering, including energy savings and costs, these are ones that we would strongly encourage you to look at from an equity perspective. It's around who has the authority or influence to implement, the cost effectiveness of the programs, the equity implications in terms of distribution, and local economic benefits. And to your point, Allison, this a point at which you really do kind of want to transition as, to some extent to understanding qualitatively how these policies compare. And this is actually a great opportunity, and there can be methods that you can use to understand the perceptions of these benefits and how those may be different from or similar to what the existing evidence out there looks like. So this is an exercise also that the GreenLink team used in Atlanta, looking at, in this case, just 3 different indicators: equity, economic development, and cost effectiveness, and then a qualitative score for each of those policies from 1 to 4. And then being able to walk through policy by policy to get stakeholder input on how those are perceived or what the evidence says, and then as a way to highlight where are the biggest opportunities, the biggest benefits. In this case, you can see commercial PACE policies were highlighted as quite beneficial for economic development, right? And in that case, it's being highlighted for further discussion or investigation. So wanted to dig in a little bit more into these dimensions, these indicators we discussed. So available authority. This is stuff that you are all quite familiar with about what is the authority that's directly available to your government. And a lot of our investigations, we often stop there, but it can be really important to also look at the dimensions of who else has authority to implement these actions: state, government, private, and particularly community. What sort of action can be done through investments outside of government, and being able to think about a spectrum of influence that these different actors have over different actions. The other way to think about this too is, what are the influence mechanisms you have, or also known as power dimensions, right? Assets that are owned, budgeting, regulation and enforcement, and vision setting. And again, this should not be just thought of only from the government perspective, because private sector and community often have the ability to do several of these things. And there are ways that our plans can take those authorities and capacities into account too. So looking at the kind of distributional equity component, and making a note here that this assessment, if you're looking at many policies still, it probably makes sense to be focused on distributional instead of the procedural and structural equity elements themselves, which will become much more significant once you've actually gotten down to designing the policies, right? How do you make sure that they're designed equitably and that they're addressing structural inequalities? But at this point, looking at who is impacted in terms of impacted groups and the likely distributional impact from exacerbating inequities to helping to begin addressing them. Cost effectiveness. I've heard comments like this come up from several of you in your reflections on your outputs from the scenario modeling, particularly around energy efficiency and how that compares to solar in these models. There's, energy efficiency is a critical investment because it's cheap and also the benefits are local. But perspective and scope mattered, as some of you also noted. Look at the time frame over which you're assessing things, whose point of view you're assessing it from, and which benefits are included can make a big difference on how different policies compare in terms of costs. And then finally, local economic benefits and equity. This is a huge element of thinking about not just how to reduce emissions, but how do you reduce emissions in a way that provides many other benefits, including jobs and reduced energy bills, air quality, etc. And this is an example of comparing energy efficiency investments with business as usual investments and looking at the difference in jobs created as a result from where spending in terms of different sectors of the economy, where that spending is going. All right, so you now have hopefully worked with community, used some data sources to inform those conversations and to be doing some qualitative assessments. And you now are able to use the data you've collected in a lot of different ways. One way you can do it, and actually Brittany's going to reference this again in her comments about Orlando, of ordering the different policy options available to you. In this case, this is a bar chart that by the height is showing the feasibility of the policy, and then the color is showing the impact. So you can see in this assessment, revolving loan fund and solar co-op were two of the options that were both high, high feasibility and high impact. There's a lot of other different ways you can use this data and visualize this data for engagement. I'm going to cover one more topic, and then we'd love to get some of your additional insights and reflections on these points. So you hopefully at this point you'll now have a prioritized list of policies and programs, and this is where the work continues. The long, hard, important work continues, right? Stakeholder engagement continues throughout, and now that we're looking at policy design and program design, these elements of structural and structural equity becomes a lot more important, and that includes through the implementation phases and how to improve over time. This is a great resource that USDN and Cadmus put together a few years ago. Many of you probably have seen it, which both provides these really useful principles for equitable clean energy program design and a way of thinking about the process and that engagement of community throughout. How to engage community at each point along the way, and importantly, thinking of it as a cycle, to not think of it as a linear process, but once you get to the end, how do you begin immediately improving it, or how do you improve throughout for continuous improvement? And as I noted, the procedural and structural equity is, again, very critical, and especially at the policy design stage. A lot of times when we're assessing policies and programs, we're not explicitly stating what the equity goal or outcome that's desired is, or stating how it's specifically defined. So here's a number of questions that are important to ask along the way from at least these three different dimensions of equity. Again, having a clear process of how impacted communities are engaged, how they're informing, and how they're building with you programs that are going to meet the core goals and needs that they have. And just a pet item of my own is we've talked a lot about how do we put those incentives in place in our work to make sure we're designing programs that meet our needs. A lot of it is about measuring and managing and how those things fit together, right? And if you're setting indicators and if you're setting incentives, those are where people are going to spend their time. So making sure that equity-focused indicators and targets are included in your program plans is essential. So here's an example from District of Columbia, where they've set a variety of different, some of which are pretty traditional energy efficiency targets, but they've also identified several that are equity-centered energy efficiency targets, making sure they have numbers around low-income energy savings and spending on efficiency programs, jobs created that are jobs associated with this energy efficiency work, and importantly also local employment, which is what the CBE spend here is, are local businesses that have 50% or more of their employment business activity in the district itself. So thinking about how those incentives are built into your program plans and targets associated with them is key to making it all work.
With that, I'm going to turn it over now to Brittany in Orlando, who's going to share a little bit more of her experience, in Orlando's experience on policy and program assessment using scenario planning.
Great, thank you so much for having me on the call today. And I'm a sustainability project manager in the City of Orlando's Office of Sustainability and Resilience. And today what I'd specifically like to share with you is how the City of Orlando worked closely with GreenLink Analytics to create a comprehensive database of our policies and programs that are related to clean energy and green buildings, and then help to develop a prioritization, selection, and design framework to help guide our stakeholder engagement specifically and ensure that we're making the most impactful decisions towards meeting our renewable energy goals across the city. Next slide, please. And like many cities, the city has made ambitious commitments to meet the city's energy demand by renewable resources over the coming decades. Pictured here, we have the date that our city council adopted our Ready for 100 resolution, agreeing to pursue 100% renewable energy as a commitment across the city by 2050. Next slide. Now, with this push for clean energy, of course, this is certainly in line with the city's existing goals of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions almost entirely by the middle of the century. But this new commitment required us to really step up and double the acceleration of our renewable energy efforts in just a few years more time. Next slide. So having made this commitment with little framework for exactly how we were going to achieve it in the specified time frame, we turned to the experts at the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab, and were fortunate enough to be selected to join their Solar Energy Innovation Network, or SEIN. Next slide. Our team consisted of representatives from the city, our utility, the Orlando Utilities Commission, the Florida Solar Energy Center, and of course, GreenLink as well. And over the course of these 18 months, through this grant-funded effort, we put together a roadmap that would help us guide both our internal and external stakeholder engagement process about how to move forward from our current fuel mix of mostly coal and natural gas on the left to entirely comprised of renewable energy on the right. This is always a cool visual to share because that solar array is actually across a coal ash landfill at our energy center. And so it's a great visual and symbolic representation of the transition that we're making. And we also, in this process of road mapping, wanted to create something that would be replicable for other cities to use as a template or a starting point to address similar questions that they have in their own jurisdictions. So one of the first questions that came to mind in our immediate team was really foundationally where to start. And it might seem quite simplistic, but starting with something familiar, like this equivalent of Maslow's hierarchy of energy needs, across our road mapping team internally really ensured that we were all on the same page, and externally and for conversations going forward really helped us to ensure that we weren't losing our stakeholders along the way when we started discussing increasingly new or technical concepts. So by using this as a basic starting point, it really made it easier and clearer for us to provide a solid foundation for the discussion of these significant and often really surprising findings that we uncovered in our work with GreenLink. For example, when viewing our clean energy scenario planning dashboard that should be familiar to many of you in this group, and talking about the fact that nearly 60% of our ability to meet our renewable goal would really be reached by maximizing our efficiency efforts and reducing our demand, we and our stakeholders were able to be kind of stay anchored with some of those initial concepts, the same shared foundational understanding, and really understanding better where each of these pieces fit. And of course, the shared understanding that we'd established from the beginning just grew increasingly important as we branched into more complex topics of the implications and trade-offs between short and long-term funding, policy planning, and the results in terms of green jobs, public health, climate resilience, and so on. The last of which is certainly top of mind right now in Florida because we are entering our hurricane season. From there, the next question that arose in terms of our order of operations was really essentially for the city sustainability staff, including myself and GreenLink, to work together to gather a comprehensive list of the clean energy policy and programs options across all sectors of the economy. We called the result of this our Clean Energy Strategy Toolkit. And this is essentially a dictionary of strategies that the city can draw on as we're seeking to effectively meet our 100% renewable energy goal. Now, once we listed out all of our available policies and programs, it could be both overwhelming and also maybe too easy to start jumping in with the most familiar or seemingly convenient strategies from this list. So our next step was to work with GreenLink to categorize the strategies by type and apply criteria that provide a justification and indication of the potential feasibility and impact of the strategies given our City of Orlando specific context. Ultimately, this process was designed to help the city understand how to prioritize our limited resources and focus on options that would most effectively help us to meet our needs. actually going to stay on this slide for just a second. One of the ways that we categorize the policies and programs in the toolkit was according to the sectors they impacted, like residential, municipal, or commercial sectors, as well as organizing them across 5 different strategies and different types of categories for these strategies, such as financing, information, program options, regulatory strategies, as well as new technologies. To understand the types of resources that would be involved with implementing these, the entities involved, staff or departmental collaboration, and so on. Next slide. So staff from our Office of Sustainability and Resilience within the city and Green Lake work together to rank the strategies according to multiple criteria and then come to a consensus regarding their relative feasibility and impact. So each strategy was ranked on a scale of 1 to 5 by each participant, and this was followed by a series of roundtable discussions to arrive at a consensus regarding the position of the scores and the relative comparisons between them. This process was based on a Geller scorecard for ranking and decision-making with qualitative data, and it was conducted over the course of several weeks. We had in-person meetings, conference calls, online shared documents. It was quite comprehensive. And for the purposes of the scorecard, we defined feasibility as the likelihood of a given strategy to be adopted by the city. And this was based on things like funding opportunities, political will, and other influential variables like administrative burden. We had already passed commercial and PACE financing, for example, at this point, but there was less of an appetite for passing something like net zero energy codes at the time. So there's a clear difference in feasibility across those types of differences. In terms of impact, we considered whether a strategy in a perfect world where it was completely feasible would allow us to actually move the needle and make impact in advancing our goals. And really the overall end goal of this process and this exercise was to produce a ranked and weighted set of strategies for consideration by the City of Orlando and to provide more of a clear understanding regarding everyone involved in the decision-making process and how these strategies compare to one another and really optimize our approach along the way. So the results shown in this visualization, seeing it again, takes into account both feasibility, again, which is shown as the height of the columns, and impact, which is depicted in the increasingly dark shades of green in terms of increasing impact along the way. So those that are the darker color green are the most impactful. And what you can see, especially looking at the far left, is our promising, really general finding across the board was that there was a higher distribution of the most feasible measures, which corresponded with the most high impact measures, meaning that the most impactful clean energy strategies that we identified from this long list, I think it was over 80 at some point, was that those that were most feasible were also the most impactful. And some of those to the far right that were less feasible just happened to be less impactful either way. So this is, the ideal essentially scenario that we have a clustering in that way. We also found that several of the most impactful factors are currently employed by the City of Orlando or were in progress. We have a municipal energy manager, solar co-ops, PACE financing, and a utility efficiency program for low-income residents. Thanks for coming back to the slide. Some other impactful strategies that were highlighted involved exploring the energy building code, expanding our benchmarking and transparency policy, and then looking into the creation of a green building incentive program. And actually by identifying this as a high impact strategy, we're able to focus our efforts further down the road with the American Cities Climate Challenge, and we're currently developing that incentive. So we've conducted sort of a micro version of the same type of categorization and ranking specifically for green building incentive programs. And we've used this to guide our conversations with external stakeholders, such as developers, and internal stakeholders, everybody from our economic development, planning, building officials, and our chief financial officer to better determine things like admin burden, political will, expense, impact on tax revenues, resilience value across the city, and so on. Moving to the next slide, one of the programs, additional programs across the community that was highlighted was the Solar and Energy Loan Fund, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to rebuild and empower underserved communities by providing access to affordable and innovative financing for sustainable property improvements. So SELF provides low interest loans to individuals who have low income or credit scores and would traditionally be considered poor candidates for financing. And what's really interesting is that they focus on humanizing the process of energy efficiency and solar financing, really illuminating the fact that they recognize that everyone has a story. In the interest of time, I'll continue to move forward, but Pamela, who's pictured there as a breast cancer survivor, she has a really great story regarding finding help to repair her roof while undergoing costly and very uncomfortable medical treatments. And that someone like Pamela is really the ideal candidate for this program, but who may not otherwise know that these type of options exist. And again, through highlighting SELF as a really impactful program and one that was already feasible but could seek some further expansion, we're able to hone in some of our efforts in the American Cities Climate Challenge, which did come later. And we're expanding the staffing for this program so that we can boost its adoption across the city, since so much of it is really just based on awareness and staff capacity. In order to further target these programs, we also work to build an energy burden map, like many of those shown earlier in the presentation, and determine several of our local demographics that could allow us to identify where programs and support like SELF are the most needed. Then to dive even deeper, we focus in on our local building stock and residence types for our ratepayers, finding that more than half of our residents in Orlando are renters, and many live in multifamily housing. So this raised the importance of programs specifically designed for renters and those in apartments and condos, and highlighted the importance of Orlando Utilities Commission's Energy Efficiency Delivered program, which provides energy efficiency improvements that are subsidized according to income level, and the remainder of which the cost of these improvements can be financed interest-free across their utility bills for up to 2 years. So again, just a further boost for pushing forward with these types of programs specifically based on what we found. And in closing, wanted to really focus on how the combination of just really both this collection of strategies and their categorization, the ranking, and the understanding of the relative importance allowed us to effectively guide decision-making in our process moving forward with our road mapping efforts, both internally and externally as an ongoing basis as we work to ensure a clean energy future. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Brittany. Really appreciate that and really making much more tangible some of the things we've been talking about abstractly. Any burning questions for Brittany? We're running a little behind, and really appreciate all of you joining and making such a robust discussion, so we can spend a few more minutes with Brittany if people have any questions. But it'd be great if you could stay with us for about another 10 minutes so we can wrap up and make sure you have clear ideas of next steps from here for the whole group. And apologies again for running a bit over our scheduled time. But any questions or comments for Brittany?
Well, if you have some that come up, obviously feel free to reach me at my email address listed there. I'd be happy to schedule some time just for a candid phone conversation, Teams meeting, or of course an email exchange if it helps to expand upon things. And since I know we crammed a lot into this session and you might need more time to digest.
All right, thanks everybody. All right, so it is time to wrap up, and again to say thank you for participation in this three-part series. This is not the end of our engagement, hopefully, but we want to give you some clear ideas around some potential next steps and ways we might keep working together. Before we do that, we did at the very beginning of our work together, we got a sense from you of how you're feeling about this work. We wanted to update this, and through a quick Mentimeter poll. This should take us less than 5 minutes. If you can go to menti.com and enter this code, we want to be able to ask you those same questions again. And here is the first question. Again, menti.com, and the code is 526557. And the question is, in single words or short phrases, what are some of your professional goals for your clean energy planning process? What do you and your city you as a professional in particular want to get out of this process. How do you want it to be designed? So again, menti.com, the code is 526557. You can put in, I think, up to 5 phrases or words. Put in as many as you feel make sense. Please contribute at least one, if you will. All right, equitable is a big word. And I remember people had said that it's too many things moving, but we'll be able to share with you the final outputs of this at the end so you can see them as well. And this word cloud, the number of times a word is entered is how big it is in the visualization here. So equitable is quite large, inclusive, also very large, community driven, many other very admirable goals. Engagement, replicable, achieve zero emissions, responsible, just, cost effective. Our jobs, your jobs are not easy, are they? Balancing all of those pieces. All right, let's maybe one more minute. Please submit any answers if you haven't yet in the next minute. Still seeing equitable coming out ahead, inclusive and community driven, also very well represented. All right. Close to 20 respondents, and we get 1 or 2 more. All right, or maybe none. All right, so thanks for your feedback on this one. We're gonna move to an even easier question because it's quantitative, but maybe harder to answer, I don't know. How confident are you now, are you about your ability to guide an equitable scenario planning process? So you as a, you in your professional roles. Okay, seeing quite a distribution. Some humps in the middle around somewhat confident. In this case, not at all confident is 0 and very confident is 10. All right, any final answers? We got to 19 last time. Oh, any more responses out there? All right, there you were, number 19. All right, cool. Thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate your inputs on this, and just as a look at what your responses were on the beginning for these 2 questions, and then our very first session. Bigger word cloud, but a lot of the same words about the same size. Equitable and inclusive, maybe even more prominent this time. And then in terms of your confidence, looks like we got a little bump, average of 5 before, and now we're up to 5.3. So I'm glad this provided hopefully some valuable input on your journey on this topic. All right, so thanks again, all of you. And next steps from here, we don't want this to be the end of our engagement. We've got a couple of different ways that we are hoping we can stay in touch. So please share your feedback as you have for the other sessions. It's really helpful in giving us a sense of what worked well and what didn't in these trainings. Also in this session, in this feedback forum, we're asking for some information from you about how can we best continue to support your work after this training session. We of course want you to use these practices and principles and the data itself that you've gained from this, and let us know how all that is working for you. Love this to also inform your work to develop a scenario planning process that's appropriate to your community needs. We know that it's going to look different everywhere. Hopefully these principles and the data itself can help with some of that engagement to make the case to do it in a robust way with equity at the center. We also want to continue engaging with you either through the feedback in that survey or by email. Also, we're going to schedule an additional set of office hours, hopefully for next week. We'll be in touch with a couple of times for that, or feel free to reach out to us by email if you have questions or are looking for specific resources. And of course, please continue to share your successes and learnings through the USDN network in a peer-to-peer way with this training team. Let us know how things are advancing for you. Just a couple of other things just wanted to note about additional resources and additional activities upcoming. So there's another project that GreenLink is participating with in partnership with Upright Services and a few other organizations. And one of the things that they're developing through this is a community engagement process guide for making use of data in climate action planning and in an equitable lens to climate action planning. So it's hopefully going to go into even a greater level of detail and resources on some of the things we've talked about in this training. And here's some of the principles around why engaging with impacted communities is critical, and some of the components of the community engagement guide around preparation, collaborative data analysis, and follow through for sustained action. So looking forward to, I know the team is looking forward to sharing that with you and many other cities in the coming months, and that should be out sometime later this summer. Also, just a reminder, we have developed this resource and reading list for this training series. It's, we have an updated version based on many of the new resources that several of you have identified and that are integrated into all these slides. So we'll be sending an updated version of that with our follow-up note with the slides from today, later today or tomorrow. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you all for your participation and your engagement on this. And thanks to all of our partners, reviewers, advisors, and researchers on this project.